third in these sessions that I'm offering, which I've entitled Prefer Nothing Whatever to Christ, Wisdom from Christian Monasticism on Living the Baptized Life. In the first two of these talks, I've proposed to you the idea that the lives of monks and nuns can teach us something about how we live our own faith. The monastic life is the baptized life, the life of a person which has been immersed in the life of Christ. And we can learn by observing the shape of it in the monasteries, whereby the withdrawal of other elements of life, the central claim of Jesus on all parts of life is revealed. The search for God in the monastery is all-encompassing. The integration offered by such a pattern of life means that God is sought, found, served, and adored in one's work, one's brothers and sisters, one's studies, one's personal experiences and hardships. In all times and all places, God awaits. However, it is time this week to turn to the practice of prayer in the monastery, those times of explicit, conscious turning towards God, which support the rest of the pattern of living. The order of nuns to which I belonged expected each of us to spend 2 hours a day in prayer outside of liturgical worship, in what language is already letting us down because no term is entirely satisfactory here. What is variously called personal prayer, silent prayer, mental prayer, contemplative prayer, and so on. My current favorite term, and I think the most accurate, is that used by the Carmelite nun Ruth Burroughs, unoccupied prayer. That is, time spent with God without an agenda of our own, time spent simply in his presence. Those 2 hours each day, one very early in the morning, one in the evening, were the foundation of my encounter with God throughout my time there, and yet they are very hard to describe. Kneeling quietly in the presence of the other sisters, seeing the light move as the minutes passed and the sun worked its way past the chapel windows, paying attention to the great carved crucifix which hangs on the east wall above the altar, shifting my position as my legs ached or grew numb, doing my best to overcome distractions and tiredness. None of this is much to write home about, and yet day after day, as those unoccupied hours passed, I was changed by this exposure to the presence of Jesus, and my own efforts to turn my will back again and again to that presence. As one friend of mine, a nun in a Carmelite house, puts it, she doesn't know how prayer works, but she knows that when she stands up at the end of an hour, she knows things that she didn't know when she knelt down, and she sees the world slightly differently. We will return later in this talk to the dynamic of what happens between the soul and God in times of prayer, but I want to begin today by acknowledging that we start at a disadvantage. We are trying to use words to address something which is at base non-linguistic, non-verbal, a relationship which is much more about looking than about talking. I want to draw today especially on the wisdom of the Carmelite tradition, with their passionate and highly developed devotion to the practice of contemplation, most fully explored and articulated by Saint Teresa of Avila. And at the risk of disappointing you, today's talk is not going to be a sustained analysis of Teresa's mystical theology, but her insights and her personality will sound throughout what I have to say today. As well as Teresa's magisterial works, The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle, and her autobiography, I've included in the suggested reading 1 or 2 books which have helped me work towards an understanding of Teresa, and I particularly commend to you Rowan Williams' treatment of her life and work, and Ruth Burroughs' commentary on The Interior Castle. A commitment to contemplative prayer is obviously not the exclusive domain of the Carmelites, but of all monks and nuns, and I would dare to suggest in the life of all the baptized. It can be understood simply as the response in love made by the will in response to the presence of Jesus. I propose that as a working definition for now, and we will see whether it holds water. I do think that what I have to say this week is in some ways a rather harder sell than our first two sessions, as I build on the central claim that monastic life can teach us how to live our own discipleship, because the monastic life is the Christian life brought into sharper focus. With the Desert Fathers and Mothers, we saw the energetic self-gift which those first monks and nuns made, their response of love to their glimpse of the love of God revealed in Jesus, and the radically changed set of priorities which had been inaugurated by the dawning of the kingdom. So far, so good. We can all know that our baptism invites the same response from us, of turning towards Jesus with our entire being. With the Benedictines last week, we spoke about the fruitfulness of a life which is given a pattern, a shape, by a set of practices in order to support our growth in freedom and joy as we seek God. And we spoke also about the vital role of life in community in this growth, made most visible and radical in the monastic pattern of living intensely and literally together, but relevant to all of us as members of the communities of our families, parishes, friendships, dioceses, and the whole Church of God. It is clear that all of these elements of the monastic life are elements of our Christian lives as well. But when it comes to contemplative prayer, from my conversations with all sorts of Christians through the years, I hear it very often seen as a special domain, either only for the professionals, for the monks and nuns who have committed their lives to it, or to people who have gone on special courses to learn tricks and techniques, or reserved to people of a certain disposition or type of personality. And I dare to suggest that none of these are quite satisfactory, that the practice of contemplation is both simpler and more immediate than we might assume. For contemplative prayer is no more nor less than the deliberate turning of the conscious mind to the presence of the Lord Jesus, who, because of his kindness and his desire for our company, is always present and accessible to us. So it is as simple and as difficult as laying aside all distractions and agendas and acknowledging the presence of God, offering our time and attention as a gift to do with as he chooses. This is part of our baptismal call, the immersion of our life in the life of God as we declare that we turn to Christ, that we enthrone him as having first claim on our love. I would suggest that it logically follows that we put that love into practice by choosing to spend time with the one we claim to love, this living God whose great love for us has compelled him to make himself available and call us to notice him and spend time with him. Teresa herself calls this type of prayer being on terms of friendship with God and frequently conversing in secret with him who we know loves us. And I want to keep the simplicity of this definition before our eyes before we go any further with Teresa, because God love her, she does have a way of organizing her teaching which tends towards a highly structured systemization of contemplative prayer. This complexity can work against us and our understanding of her focus on friendship and trust, which is at the heart of the Teresian vision of prayer. Her great treatise, The Interior Castle, is a systematic treatment of the 7 mansions, which she sees as composing the human soul, at the heart of the innermost of which dwells God. But then she acknowledges at the end of the book that the number and structure were arbitrary. They were a device to organize her thoughts rather than an objective theological truth. She writes this: "Though I have spoken of 7 mansions, yet in each of these 7 there are many others above, below, and on the sides, with beautiful gardens, fountains, and other various delights, so that you would desire even to be dissolved into the praises of that great God, who created your soul to his image and likeness. If you see anything in this method which helps to instruct you in the knowledge of him, be assured that his majesty has said it in order to comfort you and encourage you. Teresa's style, although this is the underlying truth of simplicity and friendship with God, her style is not always readily accessible. She loves an extended metaphor. She loves a numbered list. And she speaks about the presence and temptations of the devil and demons in her life with a rather Spanish immediacy and casualness which I can find startling, which I'm sure says as much about me and my context as it does about Teresa and hers. And yet, once we get our ears tuned to her style, understanding that it is formed in her immediate context, which we'll hear more about in a minute, we do start to hear from Teresa the distinctive voice of a woman of great vigor and humor, pragmatic as well as meditative, with an absolute, energetic, wholehearted focus on her Lord. Teresa became a friend to me rather than a stained glass saint around the time I learned that she loved to play the tambourine. And when I read in her autobiography the way that she chafed at having to set aside so much time to write about the spiritual life when she had so much wool to spin and practical, useful work to do. And in her autobiography, she gives her opinion of those who she thinks spend too much time talking about the devil, of which I have just accused her. Teresa writes, "Oh, the devil, we say, when we might be saying, God, God, and making the devil tremble. Of course, we might, for we know that he cannot move a finger unless the Lord permits it. Whatever are we thinking of? I am quite sure that I am more afraid of people who are themselves terrified of the devil than I am of the devil." Teresa has a way of writing with a real articulation of the darkness of the spiritual life, of living in the unknown space of the gaze of God. But this darkness is, in her great wisdom, always integrated into this bustling, active, lively personality. How clearly we can picture her and hear her, despite our 4th-century gap, when reading things like her response to those who told her to slow down a bit and get some rest. "Rest? Rest? I need no rest. What I need is crosses," was her response. And her writings are full of breaking off in the middle of a reflection on a point of the spiritual life. They suddenly stop and resume with something like, "Oh, my Lord, how much have I digressed? I have already forgotten the subject I was speaking about, for business and sickness have compelled me to put off my writing till I had more leisure, and then, having a bad memory also, I do everything without any order." So we start to see who this woman is, our teacher of prayer, who is a woman of energy which is often scattered and sometimes focused, devoted to silent prayer and devoted to life in community, devoted to her sisters, and yet aware of the fact that each soul must make its own way to God to be fully free and mature, and therefore found frequent withdrawal into silence and solitude as necessary for those who seek union with God. It's helpful at this point to give a quick biographical sketch of Teresa in her context, to understand what funds this energetic devotion and this clarity of purpose. Teresa was born in the year 1515 in Avila in Spain, and she grew up in a social atmosphere of stifling obsession with propriety and appearances, in a strictly hierarchical system of honor and duty and exchange. Her own values and practices when she founded her monastery served as a direct contrast to this, with her emphasis on friendship and equality and a refusal of any deference on the grounds of rank. She saw all around her what she called a world on fire. Europe was feeling the full force of the 16th century's religious and political upheavals and conflicts, and those who were trying to survive within them. The Spanish Inquisition was a real presence defining the shape of religious teaching available and the wider culture, including their practice of forbidding books which offered instruction in the practice of mental prayer, and their great suspicion towards women who would presume to teach on religious matters at all. This all helps to give some context to the way in which Teresa thinks and writes, and the immense vulnerability of her position. This vulnerability and outsider status she interpreted theologically and protected, understanding the place of the vulnerable to be the place in which one can stand with Christ, and refusing to stand in a position of power and privilege. It is significant, for instance, that Teresa is the daughter of a Jewish convert to Christianity in a violently anti-Semitic world. He was a businessman who had grown quickly in wealth and recently received a noble title, exactly the type of person to arouse hostility and suspicion in the settled establishment which was on guards against all threats to power and stability. This view of the world was enough to show Teresa the neurotic vanity of the world around her and sharpen her longing for a way of living with people in which God alone and God's truth and simplicity was sought, where backbiting and power play could not find a place to lodge. Teresa's insistent use of her preferred title for God, His Majesty, makes it clear that for her there is only one legitimate source of authority, that which comes from God, and before whom all other people stand equal and must not be hierarchically discriminated. Teresa, early in her life, entered a Carmelite monastery in Avila near her home, and she admits that she chose this house on the basis that she had a friend there and she'd heard it wasn't too strict. She lived there for almost 30 years, growing more and more frustrated and disillusioned. The order's Carmelite ideals of equality and simplicity were not being observed, and as one might expect, hand in hand with this, the commitment to prayer, that which lies at the very heart of Carmelite identity and vocation, was very weak. Sisters who had come from wealthy families enjoyed power and prestige. They brought their servants into the convent with them and spent their time gossiping and wearing fine clothes. Teresa did see that some of the nuns in her community were able to live holy lives even in the midst of such a degraded observation of the community, but for her it was a torment. She knew her own nature and personality well enough to see that she needed the external supports of the way of life, the prayer, the hours of silence, the manual labor, the equality regardless of rank. She needed these in her search for God, and she knew that other people would come who would need them as well. So she determined to found a reformed house, which would bring the Carmelite charism back to what it was called to be. Over the course of her life, she would go on to found not one but 14 monasteries, and they have gone on to found from them untold numbers ever since. Teresa's influence over the lives not just of Carmelites, but of Christians more broadly, is immense when it comes to our understanding of the seriousness of the call to prayer. Her biography is fascinating, but we will leave it there for the moment and consider the wisdom that we can draw from the monastic life when it comes to this question of prayer. So much of monastic wisdom, as we can benefit from it, has to do with the integration of life, of resisting the impulse to section ourselves and our time into segments with nothing to do with one another, but to rather discover them as an integrated whole, with each part of our life mutually supporting our quest for closeness with God. Work, relationships, rest, leisure, liturgical prayer, study, contemplation, none of these can survive being hacked off from the others. Teresa and her Carmelite family are crystal clear on this, that contemplation is a critical part of life, fed by and in turn feeding back into all the other ways in which we relate to God, within created reality, which reveals him to us constantly, and we can notice by the development of a contemplative worldview. The monastic life is always incarnational. It is never just abstract. She will never be simply content with relying on subjective experiences of individual prayer, but truth is rather found in following the pattern of God made flesh, that is, in relationship with the whole world and with the people around one. This was always the great test of whether experiences in prayer were genuine glimpses of God or delusions, ego-propping fantasies. And the test is whether they bear fruit in greater charity towards others. Prayer which does not lead to an increase in love and in virtue is no prayer worth speaking of, because prayer is a part of a life which is always relational. As part of my preparation for these talks, I visited our local Carmelite monastery in Kew, and I spoke with one of the nuns there about her community's life of prayer. She told me about the most common way in which young women who come to test their vocation find out that this is not the way of life for them. And it is a lack of ability not to enjoy prayer, but to find the common life, joy-giving and sustaining. People may well love silence and prayer and time alone with God, but they might balk at the reality that monastic life involves other people. And they are simply not going to cope in the monastery, where both solitude and community are lived so much more intensely than they are on the outside. Teresa was rigorous on this point. The constitutions which she wrote to govern the lives of her nuns insisted that they meet together for recreation, that is, free and shared conversation and activity, at least once a day and usually twice, for an hour in the morning and in the afternoon. Someone who cannot bear and cannot benefit from the company of others would, in the estimation of Teresa and of her close friend and colleague John of the Cross, be seen as having made little headway in her prayer, for she is not growing into the fullness of her humanity, which is always relational. The nun with whom I spoke articulated this very clearly, having met any number of women who had wanted their idea of being a nun. She said, "Community life is one of service, not just gazing into heaven and thinking about me and my Jesus. A nun must show love and be a bearer of the deep love of God for all his people. Introversion is not a problem, but a monastic needs to be happy to be with other people and able to love them." Friendship is such a central theme for Carmel. Friendship with God and friendship with other people depend on one another. Teresa insisted that her religious houses were small, unlike the large-scale institutions which other orders were often operating at the time, and even other Carmels were growing huge. She capped the number of nuns in each house at 13 in order to facilitate the pattern of community which she thought was essential for those who seek God. She said, all must be friends, all must be loved, all must be held dear, all must be helped. And this is not friendship for its own sake, but always relates back to the efforts of prayer. The long hours of silence and reflection are a vulnerable experience. The exposure to the bright light of self-examination and the comparison of one's own littleness with the beauty and goodness of God can be painful to bear. The loving trust in God, which makes contemplation fruitful and joyful, takes time and patience to develop. This confidence and self-knowledge are best developed by living in a community of acceptance, affection, and mutual support. Teresa, deeply understanding the goodness and necessity of human friendship, does go on to carefully set a limit, though. No friendship should ever be allowed to become so intimate or so exclusive that it impinges upon the innermost place in the soul, which is the dwelling place of the Lord. The possible temptation to make an idol out of another person, rather than loving them in a way to set them free to love God more, must be guarded against, even in religious houses. This is part of her wider safeguarding against any temptation to get drawn into networks which could diminish one's ability to stand empty-handed and defenseless before the love of God. All of this must be avoided. Any system of privileges and bartering and competing egos. So this is why Teresa, in the new reformed Carmels that she established, renounced participating in the usual pattern of financial survival for religious houses, which was always to have wealthy patrons who, in exchange for the prayers of the monks or the nuns, would supply their material needs. Teresa could not abide this. To transmute prayer into a social currency to be traded and invested would be for her a betrayal of her vocation. Prayer for the world and for all the people in it is too important and too sacred to commodify, and to do so would also be a loss of the vulnerability which she treasured as central to her practice of prayer, of having nothing with which to negotiate or trade, to come to God only with desire and trust. Any other source of security would be a great spiritual loss. So Teresa arranged the lives of her monasteries so as to absolutely safeguard the priority of prayer. And to fill out our picture of why Teresa was so bloody-mindedly insistent on guarding prayer and vulnerability and the sisters' access to contemplation, it's worth considering the longer and broader history of the Carmelite tradition briefly. I must restrain myself from too much indulgence in this history, which is beyond the scope of what we're speaking about. But to ease my conscience, I do recommend a book titled The Land of Carmel by Elizabeth Ruth Obbard, a nun of the monastery at Quiddenham in Norwich, which sets out the whole history from the earliest days until the 20th century. But the pertinent point I want to draw to your attention is the fact that the outward shape of the life of Carmelites has changed dramatically and unforeseeably over the last 1500 years, but its heart and priorities have remained stable. And unlike orders like the Benedictines, whose origins can be traced confidently to a specific person in a specific place at a specific time, the beginnings of the Carmelite way of life are very hard to trace. They, of course, take their name and their identity from Mount Carmel in the Holy Land, held sacred for its association with the prophet Elijah, he who heard the voice of the Lord in the sound of sheer silence, and is therefore looked to as an archetype of the contemplative. We don't know exactly when the first Christian hermits began to live and pray on Carmel. One claim that I read was extraordinary in that it claimed it was the year 83, which is both too specific and too early to put a great deal of trust in. Tradition has Saint Helena commissioning a monastery to be built here in the 4th century, and there were Byzantine monks living in a monastery under the patronage of Elijah on that mountain from the 6th century. Things come more into focus in the 12th century, when the first Western hermits, the direct ancestors of today's Carmelites, set up shop on Mount Carmel, praying and also ministering to pilgrims and those who had been displaced by the Crusades. In the early 13th century, they received their rule of life, drawn up by St. Albert, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and that rule remains the governing document for Carmelites today. It's very short, much shorter than the rule of St. Benedict, and it shows us what the key elements of this life were. Many of them are what you would expect in hermit life: shared ownership, humility, mutual obedience, manual work, silence, abstention from meat, coming together for the liturgy. But we see already the priority of prayer in a way which is not typical, in the stress that is laid on each hermit having his own cell, that is, his own bedroom, his own space, in which he could meditate day and night on the law of the Lord when not otherwise occupied. Prayer is the default setting. Prayer is fundamental, and it is what Carmelites are for. Great change lay ahead for the brothers. The Crusades compelled the Carmelites to leave their beloved mountain and move to Europe, where many of them had originally begun their lives. By the end of the 13th century, nothing of the outward life of the Carmelites was the same. Rather than living in relative solitude on a verdant Mediterranean coastal mountain range, farming and caring for pilgrims, the brothers were now living in newly crowded Western cities at a time of great social change and upheaval, with the rise of universities and an unprecedented mobility of both goods and people. So these once hermits became mobile themselves, traveling, making themselves useful by preaching, teaching, and hearing confessions, and finding a new and very different place in the changing religious landscape. But what didn't change was that commitment to the practice of contemplation as the heart of who they were and how they sought God. This is the sine qua non of being Carmelite, and the rest of life, whether it's as a hermit on Mount Carmel, or as a traveling friar, or as an enclosed nun, as they were eventually brought into the picture, all of the rest of life must be arranged to preserve and facilitate this prayer. I find this history a very encouraging lesson for the whole Church, as we find ourselves always in relationship with changing contexts. The question turns out not to be a binary opposition of being faithful to the tradition or adapting to the ways of the world, but rather the way forward is to understand the heart of our vocation and find ways in the world in which it can bear fruit. This frees us from existential anxieties about survival or relevance or viability, and focuses instead on faithfulness to the God who has himself promised to be faithful. So let's return again to that question of prayer itself, which is the beating heart of this whole tradition, which the Carmelites so completely understand about themselves. The Teresian understanding of contemplative prayer, of spending time in the company of Jesus as a beloved friend, is simple and attractive, and yet we would be mistaken to think that Teresa or anybody else finds it easy. I am not infrequently asked for advice about this type of prayer, as people know a little of my history, and I'm always glad to be asked, but I think I almost always disappoint my askers. There is an appetite for techniques, which I do not and cannot furnish. Rather, I think it is better to take seriously that definition of Teresa which we heard earlier, that prayer is being on terms of friendship with God and frequently conversing with him who we know loves us. We see then this is not a practice or a skill to be honed, but more a relationship to be entered into with ever-growing trust and openness. There are, of course, pieces of practical spiritual usefulness in Teresa's writings, which can be enormously helpful for those setting out on the journey of contemplation, particularly, for example, her metaphor of the four waters, which was used to teach us in the convent and which I include in its short form in your handout. But if prayer is fundamentally the relationship between two persons in love with each other, the soul of the person praying and the person of the living Lord Jesus, then it is only possible to develop it through time and through growth in love, not by study and not by advice from other people. The committed, repeated practice of showing up, by which I mean both physically committing to perseverance, but also showing up with all of who we are, with our whole attention given to the current moment, rather than in what might have happened before, or our anxieties or hopes for the future, but being content to dwell in the moment where we are. This is the human part to play in this dynamic. It is being there. The writer who I find most eloquent and most useful in articulating the Teresian dynamic of prayer is the Carmelite nun Ruth Burrows, who I've already mentioned. And I've put references for not one but 3 of her books in your handout because she really is so insightful. And when I have these people ask me about prayer and I say, I can't give you advice, you just have to do it, I ultimately usually ends up with me photocopying 2 or 3 pages of one of Burrows' books and giving them to them. Because she articulates prayer, this kind of unoccupied prayer, as not something that we do at all, but entirely the work of God within us. Our role is to be present and available and receive his love. We cannot work for or earn this love. There is only an invitation to which we are called to respond. Teresa says, in contemplation, we don't do anything ourselves. Neither do we labor, nor do we bargain, nor is anything else necessary. So I quote here from Ruth Burrows about what this experience of prayer is like in her many decades in the monastery. Twice a day, we leave every occupation aside, and as far as possible, the mental occupation that accompanies it, and we set ourselves before God, exposed in our naked reality, undefended by the ritual of liturgy, planned meditation, or techniques with which to maintain control, with nothing whatever to offer except ourselves and our desire to receive God's outpoured love. Apart from faith, such hours have no meaning. They are a waste of time. But faith assures us that they are pregnant with significance, not only for ourselves, but for the Church. We are offering God the very best opportunity for his divine action, inviting his purifying love to penetrate every corner of our being so that everything in us is transformed. God's action, God's giving of himself during these hours, will not normally be experienced by the conscious mind and may afford little satisfaction, not even of the assurance that we are really praying. What is more, it will reveal our spiritual indigence and shatter all complacency, and this will demand on our part a humble trust. Over and over again, we need to reaffirm our faith in God's unconditional love, unwavering in its attention to us, and ground ourselves on his fidelity, his word, not on how we feel, how it seems to us. Prayer is essentially what God does for us. Our part is to be there, wanting him to do all he wants, to give all he wants, and believing that he does so, though we receive no sensible reassurance. This is the pattern of prayer to which Carmelites and all monastics commit themselves, but it is not their domain alone. This type of prayer requires no special equipment or training, only love or the wish to love, and faith or the desire to have faith. The great advantage over us which monks and nuns do have is their rule of life, the daily pattern which calls them back again and again to this practice, which can be so difficult for those of us outside the monastery. Having made a certain claim now about the wordlessness and starkness of Teresian prayer, I do want to qualify it a little. There were some strands of teaching current in Teresa's time among the material she was reading as she learned about prayer, which sought an ideal of a supposed purity of prayer, free from any support of images or words, the idea of wanting to be liberated from all material sensations. And although Teresa did value unmediated intimacy with God, she does not follow this extreme level of inward asceticism seen in such writers as Evagrius Pontus, this rejection of using all of what God provides on the path towards union with him. Teresa is too firmly grounded in the incarnation. She takes too seriously the fact that it is this life, this earthly reality, that God has placed us in our search for him. So she writes this, and again her distinctive voice of energy and common sense shines through. We are not angels, we have bodies. To want to become angels while we are still on earth is ridiculous. As a rule, our thoughts must have something to lean on, though sometimes the soul may go out from itself and very often may be so full of God that it will need no created thing to assist in recollection. She writes of her own experiences in the first 12 years of the practice of prayer as always needing a book with her at the start of prayer time, of having a terror of the idea of entering undefended the practice of prayer, using a book, whether of the scriptures or spiritual writing, as a starting point from which she could be led into the silent contemplation of God. And Teresa, time and again, does this by drawing deeply on the scriptures and reflecting on them as she writes, as she publishes, and to the horror of those who are editing and commissioning her, because she knows and they know that her books are being scrutinized by the Inquisition, who could not tolerate a lay person and indeed a lay woman teaching about scripture. It's quite extraordinary, her bravery and the way in which the Inquisition would come and accuse her and saying, "You're teaching about scriptures," and she would say, "Oh, no, I'm not," and she would carry on doing it. Her force of will and charisma and the evident holiness of her way of life somehow carried her through. And the scriptures are absolutely central for her. The daily exposure to the Word of God, which she has in the Mass and in the offices each day, richly furnished a mental landscape with images and language to give supports on the way to that ever-growing wordless intimacy with the Lord. Teresa is absolutely steeped in Scripture. She returns time and again as she learns and teaches about prayer to the figures of Mary and Martha, and of Mary Magdalene, and of the Samaritan woman. She wrote very daringly a commentary on the Song of Songs, and above all, time and again, she turns to the person of the Mother of God, whose perfect knowledge of Jesus in both his humanity and his divinity is Teresa's paradigm for spiritual maturity, of standing, gazing in love at God and being held in his loving gaze. It is not for nothing that the order is devoted to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the paradigmatic contemplative for Teresa. Teresa knew and she taught that all things in her life were given to her as supports for her growth in contemplation, to that moment of simplicity and purity when she could be in the presence of the one whom she loved most, the one for whom she had given everything to seek and follow. The scriptures, the saints, images, texts, guidance from trusted advisors, adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, the liturgy of the hours, her daily experiences of friendship and work and suffering, all of this created for Teresa and can create for us a scaffold for contemplation, a way into that relationship of wordless, loving mutuality with the living God. So while contemplation is that simple, pure space of turning towards God, meaning that it cannot be taught or strategized any more than any other kind of friendship can be taught or strategized, it's also not abstractly removed from any other part of life. It is in dynamic relationship with the whole of life, for it is the turning towards God who dwells in, to use Teresa's own imagery from the interior castle, God who dwells in the innermost mansion of our soul and waits there for us to approach him. Whether we are in the monastery or out of it, whether we are trained or untrained, I think untrained is rather more useful, whatever our personality type, we can all respond to the invitation from God to pay attention to the one we have promised to love. So we are all called by grace of our baptism to be involved in the life of contemplation and to find the joy and freedom and sweetness which awaits us there. I leave my thoughts on Teresa and contemplation at that point, and next week when we meet again, we will look at a tradition even closer to home, at the monastic life within the Anglican communion, and just how it came to be reborn after the Reformation in the face of really quite vigorous and often aggressive attempts by secular and ecclesial hierarchies to stamp it out, it's always worth asking why this way of life will not die, and what is so distinctively Anglican about it anyway. If anyone has any questions they feel they must ask, I'm happy to try to answer them either now or at the door if you don't want to be exposed to everyone's thoughts.